Alright, that's not me. That's me. Alright, hello and welcome back, everyone. We are going to be continuing reading through the book that I wrote in 2020. I haven't read through this book in quite some time, so this is kind of, I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but we're going to be reading through it. We are currently on chapter 5, The Problem of Helplessness. The point of the book, or the aim of the book, is, this should be in all of the kind of title chapters, but I guess we started only putting it in kind of at the later date. But this is discussing how we get agency from the source of being. We've developed kind of this theoretical starting point, which is that the area in which you have control over is your attention. And from there, we're trying to get to effective action in the direction of our values. And so we're building a bit of a bridge from this theory where you have agency is your ability to continue to attend to something. And that's kind of where we are at now, getting through the first two blocks. And now we're focusing on the third block, which is the problem of helplessness, as well as some solutions. And that is, we have to actually take action in the... And then this is kind of the subject of this chapter for today. Hey Richard, are we talking about unknowns or unknown unknowns? Known unknowns or unknown unknowns? We don't know which of the unknowns we're talking about, which is the most dastardly. The stream title doesn't match the chapter title? No way. Did I mess up? Oh, the problem of helplessness. Jesus. We will fix that. We will fix the stream titles. We're talking about the problem of helplessness. It was unknown which problem we were talking about, and then we started talking about the correct problem. So, stream manager. Could I change the title here? I need an adult. We talked about the problem of the unknown. That was the last problem. That's why, in my head, it was correct. That was the problem from last block. So that was chapter 3 was the problem of the unknown. This is the problem of helplessness. Okay. So let's get into it. We have a quote from Viktor Frankl, who is going to be, we're going to quote a little bit more throughout, I think. And we have a quote from Daniel Kahneman. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. For those of you who don't know, Viktor Frankl was a victim of the Holocaust, which we're about to discuss here. And he survived, and he wrote a book about it called Man's Search for Meaning that's quite a prolific self-help book. It's like probably... It might be one of the top 5 or top 10. And his position is a very, stoic type of one, which is that they they can take away everything from you, except for your ability to interpret your scenario. That you always have. And here we have a quote from Daniel Kahneman. Attention is key. Our emotional state is largely determined by what we attend to. And we are normally focused on our current activity and immediate environment. We draw pleasure and pain from what is happening at the moment if we attend to it. This quote was just it's so banger in line with some of the things we're talking about. Was so excited when I stumbled over it while reading. I think it's from Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman's book. Kahneman's gotten pretty old now. He is Israeli... American author who won, he's a psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, which is kind of an unheard of type of thing, but here he is. He was born in 1934, so that means this year he will be celebrating his, 90th birthday, or he's already 90, shout out to him just turning 90, so, I don't think he's going to be publishing any new books. And his last book was actually co-authored by 5 people, so I have to imagine that he didn't have too much to do with it, although it was kind of in line. It looked like it was less written by him, but heavily influenced by him. So, but we'll continue. So, unspeakable. The changes in industrialization in the 19th century, we might have to rewrite this entire intro because we've learned so much about industrialization since we've read this. But the changes that industrialization in the 19th century brought about The changes that industrialization in the 19th century brought about a sense that humanity was reaching a new stage of development, and in many ways it was, with unparalleled production. Oh my god, this sentence, I don't like the way this is worded. Brought about a sense that humanity was reaching a new stage of development, and in many ways it was, with unparalleled production and new technology that seemed like magic. Is that really that bad, though? The changes in industrialization. The problem is this is too much of a dangling sentence, or what's the right word for it? This is too much cognitive load in a clause. All this up here. The changes of that industrialization in the 19th century brought about. Changes in that industrialization in the 19th century brought about. Or here. A sense that humanity. Is that... Alright, we'll leave it for now. Maybe we come back to it. The spirit of the time was that the increase in productivity meant that all of humanity was destined to live better lives. I do not think that was the spirit of the time anymore. So we might have to rewrite this entire bit. I think that a lot of people were suffering during industrialization. Certainly amongst intellectuals, this might have been the spirit. Brought about is overloaded there. It should really be doubled to be grammatically correct. Is that what the problem is? You were right. That's exactly what it is. The changes that in the industrialization of the 19th century brought about a sense that humanity was reaching... Yep, you're correct. The spirit of the time was that this increase in productivity meant that all of humanity was destined to live better lives, that innovation... Well, to be fair, some people thought this. This is maybe fine. That innovation would solve the problems of want and need. 1851 was the year of the first World's Fair, where nations would gather to both show off and celebrate innovation. It was a time that lived on the heels of the Enlightenment, which espoused the liberation of humankind as well as inspired the subsequent revolutions to that end. It was a time of optimism. The First World War cracked that optimism, but even then it was unthinkable that the war would one day be called the First World War. Yeah, back when it was the Great War, it was then called the War to End All Wars, optimistically. The Second World War, or more specifically, the inhumanity of the Holocaust, the destructive powers of the nuclear bomb, shattered that optimism and faith in the progression of humanity through technology. Okay, maybe I don't dislike the paragraph's okay. There was a conception that technology itself would somehow solve the problems of humankind. It won't. Technology is a tool that merely amplifies the capacity of humans who wield it. Railroads and radios can be used to organize humanitarian efforts, just as they can be used to organize the rounding up of ethnic and religious minorities, as they were in the Holocaust. Technology is a tool. This video is going to get demonetized because we're going to say Holocaust, but it'd be like that. Technology is a tool, but taking responsibility is human. What the Second World War revealed was that new technology did not, by its intrinsic nature, herald the end of human suffering. Instead, it merely enhanced the cause it was set upon, whether it was destruction, creation, or destruction. The Holocaust claimed the lives of millions of Jews in areas occupied by Germany's Third Reich. Psychologist Viktor Frankl was one of the few who managed to survive and recounted how he survived, both physically and psychologically, in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. The billowing chimneys were the first sight to greet prisoners on the train pulled into their car as the train pulled their car into the station at Auschwitz. What's another word for train car? Rail car. Into the station at Auschwitz. After arriving at the concentration camp and being separated from the women, the men were separated into two groups. 9 out of 10 were separated from Frankl into the other group. Both groups were then sent to the showers as a means of cleansing. Frankel's shower released water to him and the rest of the 10% of his group. The showers for the other 90% just released gas poison. Frankel talks of when he inquired as to the fate of his friend that was separated into the other line. A hand pointed to the chimney. It was a few hundred yards off, which was sending a column of smoke. Which was sending a column of flame up into the gray sky of Poland. It devolved into a sinister cloud of smoke. "That's where your friend is, floating into heaven," was the answer. But I still do not understand the truth until the truth was explained to me in plain words. I think this quote's sufficiently long that it has to be its own paragraph. Wagon would have been good. I think railcar works. But wagon would have been good too. Car just like sounds weird though. Right? Or like it summons the wrong, when I read it, it summons the wrong image in my head. I'm sure when I wrote it, it didn't. But that's like, yeah. That's why you reread things. Although to be fair, I don't know if I'm gonna try and publish it, but we're just kind of farming it for content to some extent. Alright. He remarks that the goal of the camps was the extermination of bodies, but not until all the use had been extracted from those bodies with forced labor. Frankel describes how the bodies of the prisoners became nothing but skin stretched over bone, under the rations of watery soup, a slice of bread, and a little bit extra jam, a slice of sausage. He recalls that the thought of suicide was entertained... That's gonna demonetize me. The thought of unalivicide was entertained by nearly everyone, if only for a brief time. It was born out of the hopelessness of the situation, the constant danger of death looming over us daily and hourly, and the closeness of our deaths suffered by many others. Even the gas chambers lost their horrors for him after the first few days. After all, they spared him the act of committing unalivicide. Is this too long that I can't have it in paragraph? Bro. I think it is. I forget. I'm not sure what the convention is exactly, but I think that is too long to not have its own little paragraph for it. And it also ends the paragraph, so if I'm ending the paragraph on it, maybe it's okay to do like this. In the later portion of his book, Frankel repeatedly quotes a line from Nietzsche. He who has a why to live can bear with almost any how. Of the prisoners, only the capos, enforcers picked from perhaps the most sadistic prisoners, continued to smoke. Everyone else traded the cigarettes they were occasionally given as a form of payment. For food. We emphasized the trade a little bit too much, art of the deal. Smoking was emblematic of giving up hope. Thus, when we saw a comrade smoking his own cigarettes, we knew he had given up faith in his strength to carry on, and once lost, the will seldom returned. The important thing to note for our discussion is that the feeling that nothing they did mattered, or it's hard to build up a form of practice in our hows if we think that our efforts are meaningless. The perceived meaninglessness of one's actions is at the core of helplessness. You wouldn't use the Holocaust as an example unless it's entirely relevant. I'm mainly using the Holocaust... Well, Why exactly do you think it's not appropriate to use the Holocaust as an example? So the main reason I wanted to use this as an example is because it dovetails very nicely into Viktor Frankl's work. Who we lean on quite a bit. Certainly it would not be the example if I was going on YouTube. But if it's going in a book, it is relevant. It's highly relevant. Also, it's like literally kind of like the worst situation is kind of the point. The thing is I cannot think of a situation where someone is, objectively speaking, more helpless. And so if we're trying to articulate the problem of helplessness, I think it's useful. Also, when I'm outlining the problems, I'm trying to tell a story that is a little bit that seizes on the attention a little bit. We could get through it and then maybe we could talk about it, but I'm open to the idea that it's not a good example. But I think one of the points to emphasize is that this is just like the most helpless situation, basically. It's easy to understand how one became hopelessness in the concentration camps, and in some sense uninteresting. What is more interesting is how some managed to cling on to hope, and with that hope, helped to ensure their own survival. Prisoners were systematically denied freedom for action. Their agency was stifled, snuffed out like a candle. Yet Frankel insists that they still had some freedom left, and that how they exercised that remaining freedom would give meaning to their seemingly meaningless suffering. It's a heavy topic that's easy to accidentally trivialize. That's fair. I'm not saying it's wrong to use it here, since I don't know where you're going with it. Well, I mean, my point... I think the situations where humans are most helpless are probably just, in general, going to be heavy. To speak of some of the ideas we've already looked at, how can we, in such a helpless situation, possibly create all three of the beliefs necessary for change? I can't change this. I must be the one to change this. This must change. Certainly, this must change was an obvious belief held by the prisoners, but in what sense could the prisoners possibly formulate the belief that they could change their predicament, that they could escape the horror? We've discussed that that attention is the side of agency. For Frankel, the capacity to change was possible, but that capacity lay in the individual's only freedom that could not be stripped from them: the freedom to choose what things the freedom to choose what meanings things would have for them. They could not choose the camp, but they could choose to interpret their situation, and in doing so, find a sense of purpose to cling on to. Are we as Frankel thought, though? So I think we circled back around to Frankel, but that's definitely a point. I don't think I've trivialized it here. I agree it's heavy, but that's definitely a concern, because the stuff that's just generally emotionally heavy, generally doesn't produce as much effect on me, but okay, we'll continue on for now. Weight loss is a common action that people want to take, but struggle to follow through with. It's fairly easy to make sense of this using the elephant to the rider metaphor we discussed last chapter. The elephant wants to eat. The rider tries to convince the elephant that eating in excess isn't the way to go. For many, the elephant is stronger and wins out. The analogy helps to explain this inner conflict. It also paints a picture why brute force willpower isn't always effective. The rider is considerably weaker than the emotional elephant. Brute force won't work. The rider needs to be strategic. The dieting book Thinfluence is something of an oddity as far as dieting books go. It doesn't say much in terms of what you should or should not eat. Its central thrust isn't a system or diet itself, but rather a re-examination of the factors that lead to good or bad diets. The first nutrition, and then we have a little bit of a footnote. The first nutrition book I ever read when I was a teenager was The Bodybuilder's Nutrition. Oh my god. My brother read it as well. We used to quote our favorite line in it to each other: "Find out what's making you fat and eliminate it from your diet entirely." It was blunt and emblematic of the dieting is willpower way of thinking that Thinfluence rejects. According to the authors, the weight loss and a healthy diet isn't a matter of willpower, it's a matter of Thinfluence. Man, that book was such a banger, The Bodybuilder's Nutrition. But the line was just like, oh my god, it's just like so blunt. Find out what's making you fat and eliminate it from your diet entirely. Just like no mercy. And I used to shame my brother for using ketchup when we were both cutting. You definitely need a bridge between death camps and weight loss, though. That's probably true. That's probably true. I can get behind that. We'll put in that we need a bridge there. Here, we'll put emotional. Influence, noun, the powerful and surprising effects friends, family, work, and the environment have on weight. If you have bad genetics for staying thin, you have roughly twice as great a chance of obesity than if you had especially good genetics. Eating off smaller plates makes you Eating off smaller plates makes you eat less than if you ate off larger ones. Living near fast food restaurants or farther from larger grocery stores that have more healthy options makes you more likely to be obese. Eating in front of the television makes you more likely to eat more than if you were paying attention to what you were eating. Living in an area that's less walkable makes you more likely to be obese. The other noted research that indicated that what is this at the start? The others noted research that indicated that that's such a weird sentence. Let's fix it. Oh, okay. It's because I got this thing. I corrected a misspelling of authors to others. The authors of Thin Influence noted research that indicated where one lives geographically, proximally to available fast food or fresh healthy options affected obesity and metaphorically dubbed these environments oasis, jungles, or deserts. We might live in a jungle of options where fast food is the most attention-grabbing thing in the world of attention. We bite. There we go. To use the metaphor in the world of attention, we might live in a jungle of options where fast food is the most attention-grabbing thing that draws us in. Oh, no. This isn't right. Okay. Let's just do this. We might live in a jungle of options, for example, where fast food is the most attention-grabbing thing that draws us in. I live alone on top of a hill near a grocery store, and I'm still overweight. The one of the things is that like Thinfluence, it increases your probability it's not deterministic. And like anytime you're looking at like these types of things, you have to look at both this and the other stuff. But you also just might have shit genetics, right? And this is not a willpower thing. it can be overcome, but like all of these things can in theory be overcome, but we'll get to it. But it's certainly going to be a lot easier. I mean, let's continue reading, because we're going to talk about a lot of stuff related to this, or at least a little bit. All these things may seem intuitively true, but there's an important structure to recognize here. These are all external influences, independent of our personal choice. Though our writer may very well be committed to our diet, our environment dictates where the attention of our dear friend the elephant is going. Our environment appropriates our attention. What's more, many of these factors, like advertisement, are being consciously controlled by others. Whether or not it's conscious should be irrelevant if our aim is agency, but it certainly feels more relevant as a consequence of human psychology. As our reference to Lakoff in Chapter 2 notes, impingements on freedom as a consequence of nature seem less problematic as those are done by other people. Okay. These individuals who have vested interest in seeing us eat in an unhealthy way, not because of a lack of health is good for them, but because our health is an irrelevant detail to the bottom line. Right? The people who make Oreos make more money when you eat more of them. Who's the easiest target? Kids. Over a third of ads to which kids are exposed are advertising for candy and snacks, an amount that adds up to more than 7,600 ads a year. I'm not sure how advertising towards kids has changed in the last 4 years. I think it probably has quite a bit. Even the way supermarkets are set up is done in a predatory way. Staples like milk and eggs are placed at the back of the store so that we will have to walk through aisles of attention-grabbing junk food in order to get to them. This increases the likelihood we will spend more money and eat more calories. In some way, it's like the engagement paradigm of social media. The layout of stores exploits our attention for the benefit of the store, not for us. These sorts of things aren't entirely bad news. We can use them to inform our own practice as well. For example, stores will put more expensive name brands on the middle shelf aisles at eye level. The profit margins are better for name brands, and the brand sells better. We can use this knowledge ourselves, however, with how we organize our pantry or fridge. We can put the healthier options in the middle shelves and the junk food on the top or bottom shelves. The thinfluence problem isn't one of willpower or commitment to one's decision. It's a barrage of attention one's mind places on the bad foods, whatever nutritional paradigm one might take, because bad is so different for like so many different people. The unyielding attention warps one's perceived availability of action until at some point or another, binging or deviating from the diet seems like a good decision. And this is back to like the warped perception, talking about. Do I want to really call back specifically? I think that just warps is probably fine. And that's all it takes. If the attention is always on the bad foods, then it only takes a momentary slip in the rider's willpower to eat the bad foods. If attention weren't on these bad foods, however, slips in the willpower wouldn't lead to binging. The task isn't so much as us to think in the diet in the right way as it is to not think about foods in the wrong way, which, if we recalled what we learned about OCD, is the rub. With the 4 steps mental exercise we reached through with the 4 steps mental exercise we reached that end through redirection. The thinfluence argument is that we should proactively work to make our environments such that we are influenced in a healthy way. That is to say, we should eliminate the things in our environment that cue thoughts we want to avoid. Thoughts. We need to make sure that our models of dieting are informed by environmental factors. But isn't that in some sense an admission that we lack willpower and agency to control our actions? I don't know if I really even want to invoke Stephen Covey in here anymore. But the Circle of Influence is going to talk about Stephen Covey. The authors of Thinfluence have a way of representing... Oh. Okay. The authors of influence have a way of representing the degree to which something is external. They have a circle of influence. At the center is the inner self, which houses genetics and physiological factors. Move one layer out, and you're at relationship, friends, co-workers, family. Is co-workers spelled wrong? No? Oh. It is spelled wrong. Workers with an E. You might not be able to change your family, but you can influence them or try and work with them to set up a better home environment. The same goes for our friends and coworkers, except we might be in a better position to change those. One more level is environment, including workplace, physical environment, and food environment. Changing these is harder. We'd have to change jobs or where we live. The outermost layer is the overarching societal factors, which include policies of the media of which we have the least control. This type of modeling allows for a nuanced consideration of the degrees to which something might be environmentally determined, as opposed to those factors which we may be responsible for. So we have, and the goal is to increase your circle of influence by being proactive. We brought up Covey's in our discussion on proactivity, where he characterized as one of the habits of effective people. His argument was as to how proactivity increases agency is relevant here. Covey uses a model of similar concentric circles to illustrate important distinctions between things one has control over and things one is concerned with. According to Covey, so the goal of, this is Covey here, which we might not want to invoke anymore, but the idea is that you have this circle of influence and a circle of concern. And what you do when you are proactive is you expand your circle of influence to create more overlap between what you have influence over and what you are concerned with by being proactive. And if you're reactive, your circle of influence will shrink. The proactivity is like definitely a good thing. Covey's also super OG in like the self-help thing. Find out what makes you fat and eliminate it from your environment, basically. I mean, like, so we might talk about the study, but I think about this study all the time, which is this airplane study where the smoking on airplane study. And in it, they had stewardesses who were smokers, and they tested them to see how much the craving they were having. And what they found was craving did not actually increase by a large amount on really long flights. If you had a 6-hour flight or an 1.5-hour flight, you wouldn't have really greater cravings on the 6-hour flight. Instead, what they found was that cravings would only increase, not with the length of the flight, but with how close you were to landing. That is, how close the opportunity you had to the ability to smoke. And so if they didn't perceive that they had an opportunity to smoke, they wouldn't experience the craving. And this is such an interesting thing because dopamine, right, is not actually the reward. You don't get dopamine from the reward, you get it from the anticipation of the reward. And with the smoking, as it relates to like or thinking of that plane study as it relates to like eating poorly, if you don't actually view the unhealthy eating as an option, whether it's because it's out of your attention entirely or because it just doesn't appear like an option, you actually won't have the craving for it. And so then the question becomes, how do you make it not feel like an option? In the same way that the stewardesses feel like smoking in the middle of a 6-hour flight is not an option, because they would lose their job if they just like lit up in the middle of the plane, right? And so, but it's such a fascinating study that like they don't crave based on how long they've been in the air. They crave based on how close they are to landing, how close they are to being able to smoke. Why don't you want to invoke Covey anymore? He's super... I guess maybe Covey's still okay. He just... he's like super OG, like in the self-help sphere. Maybe that's still fine. I also think that... No, I mean Covey fits. Covey still fits. I mean, I have to... one of the big things I'm using him for is his diagrams, though. But he fits, and I'm using his quotes. I feel like I actually can't even articulate why I'm not liking Covey so much. And maybe that's no good. Because it's not like I've read him and been like, actually, you know what? This guy's wrong about everything. I think maybe I have a disagreement on whether or not you actually can increase your circle of influence, but I actually do think you can. So, like, I think that, so for example, the food you see is in your circle of concern, and to use the thinfluence like model or thinking about the food you see is in your circle of concern, right? And you might think it's not within your circle of influence, but in your own house you can put the healthy food at eye level and put the junk food lower on, which would effectively be increasing your circle of influence because now you have influence over the food you see because you're proactive about the sorting of your food on various shelves, right? But if you are entirely reactive, if you just put it on whatever shelf is available, then you lose, your circle of influence constricts, and you no longer have influence on what foods you see, even though that isn't within the circle of concern for you, because in the realm of thinfluence, if you see it, you're more likely to eat it. Because if you see it, you'll think of it as being available. Like, when you drive home from work past fast food, you view that as being available in the same way that the airline stewardess about to get off her flight views smoking as available. And if you just don't view it as available, then it's not going to give you the same level of temptation. And so, I mean, like, one way you can do it is, like, if you can view it as just not being an option, which is harder, because it certainly appears as an option, or you could just not view it, which is to say you could take a different route home. I know when I bought a snack, it blows my mind. It's on my mind until I eat it. While if I didn't have any snacks, I might not think about it all day. It's exactly the same thing because, like, it's in your brain, it's like available. And so, like, the idea is how can I create an environment that is more conducive towards this, these types of attitudes. I hope I talk about the stewardess flight, because I think that's such an important study. I know I mentioned it at some point in this book, but it's so eye-opening that it's like, that's how your brain works. It doesn't have anything to do with how long it's been. Or, like, the correlation is extraordinarily weak between cravings for a cigarette and how long it's been since you've had a cigarette. It's just, like, if you have the ability to do it. So, like, if you haven't bought the snacks, right, then in your mind, it's not an option for you to have the snack. But if you now have bought it, suddenly it's, like, available in the same way. And it's why, like, a lot of weight loss strategies also work a lot better, that seem, like, kind of stupid. Like, for example, when you have a snack and you serve yourself a portion and then you go to eat, instead of bringing the bag with you to watch in front of the TV or something like this, you eat so much less, because it's not... If the bag's available next to you, it's seen as being an option, whereas if it's, like, on a plate... and then the plate, there's no more on the plate, then suddenly it's, like, not seen as much an option in your mind. But okay, let's get back to Covey. According to Covey, proactive people focus on their circle of influence. They work on things that they can do something about. The nature of their energy is positive, enlarging, and magnifying, causing their circle of influence to increase. Reactive people, on the other hand, their efforts is in the circle of concern. They focus on the weakness of other people, the problems in the environment, and the circumstances of which they have no control. Their focus is on blaming and accusing attitudes, reactive language, and increased feelings of victimization. The negative energy generated by that focus, combined with neglect in areas they could do something about, causes their circle of influence to shrink. Covey's conclusions are quite similar to the Stoic approach we will be discussing in the next chapter. For now, let's focus on the structure of his model, which bears similarities to the thinfluence circle of influence, beyond sharing a name. The circle contains all that which concerns us, and wholly contained inside of that is our circle of influence, which denotes all the things we have control over. What he refers to as the circle of concern contains everything that is not inside the circle of influence but still concerns us. We can think of this denoting control as being internal in the case of influence and external in the case of circle of concern. We can, for example, control our route home from work, perhaps driving past fewer fast food restaurants on our route, circle of influence, but barring illicit approaches, we don't have much control over the fact that the restaurants are there, circle of concern. The central focus of this chapter is how we present the worlds to ourselves in these terms: internal, external, control, responsibility. What is external outside of our control? What is internal inside our control? Are we in control of, or do we merely feel in control? What are the implications of this? What should we take responsibility for, and what should we blame the environment for? What should we blame on the environment? Do we think of the events of our lives as being internally or externally, and what are the consequences of such beliefs? Okay, learned helplessness. In chapter blank, because we don't have chapter numbers yet, we discussed how the psychological disorder of OCD can impede agency by making it difficult to direct one's own attention. Depression is another psychological disorder that can impede agency, but through a much different pathway. Depression causes us to paint maps of the world in which we believe that nothing we do matters, or in psychological terms, we experience learned helplessness. If our maps filter what we consider possible, and the maps are constructed with the presupposition that our actions are ineffective, then such maps will not be useful for us, useful in dynamically providing us with available options or actions. When Martin Seligman, who would later become the founder of positive psychology, first arrived as a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, the staff there were conducting an experience on Pavlovian conditioning. Dogs were being trained to associate a neutral noise with a mild shock. The idea being that by associating the two in the dog, the experimenters could get the dog to display the same fear response to that tone as they did the shock. In this particular experiment, the dogs were placed in a box with a low wall and 2 compartments. The natural response of the dog to the shock would be to jump from one compartment to the next, thereby avoiding the shock. However, during the training, through which the dogs were made to associate the shock with the noise, they were restrained, and they would be unable to jump from one partition to the other. The experimenters wanted to see if they could get the dogs to respond to the now conditioned stimulus of the noise by jumping from one side partition to the other, as they did in response to the shock before the training took place. The only problem was, now the dogs weren't jumping over the partition at all, even in response to the shock that they'd more than willingly avoided before the conditioning. They were just laid down and took the shocks while whimpering. The experimenters were stumped. Even though it wasn't his experiment, Seligman had an insight. The dogs hadn't been that the dogs had been conditioned, didn't learn to jump over the partition in response to noise. They learned that nothing they did mattered. Nothing could stop the shocks. They had learned to be helpless. This was at a time when the behaviorist school of thought was popular in psychology. Now it's basically dead. And it wasn't thought that you could teach something that involved internal cognition, like helplessness, only that you could condition behavioral responses. Seligman was the first to push the hypothesis, further in a similar experiment of his own. The only problem was the unanswered question. What if it was just the pain and not the lack of control that produced the behavior of laying down and taking the shocks? If Seligman was going to see if the inability to affect one's environment led to the feelings of learned helplessness, then he would need a control for the fact that the shocks, and not the inability to respond to them with a feeling of agency, might be the driving factor in creating helplessness. Most studies have 2 groups: an experimental group which receives the treatment that is being studied, and a control group that does not. Seligman's solution was to have 3 groups. The first group would be shocked, but would be able to turn off the shock by pushing a panel with their noses. The shock was escapable by the dog's own actions. The second group would be yoked to the first one. They would be subject to the exact same shock as the first group, which would be turned off when the dog from the first group touched the panel. The shock would be for the exact same duration, but there was nothing that the dogs in the second group could do to themselves to affect the duration. They were deprived of a feeling of agency. The third group wouldn't be shocked at all. Like the previous experiment, the learning was tested in 2-compartment box where the dog could jump from one shocking compartment to the other. Seligman Like the previous experiment, the learning was tested. I maybe want to reword this because I think it's ambiguous whether or not it's the learning following the conditioning. Was tested in a 2-compartment box where the dog could jump from the shocking compartment to the safe one. Seligman recounts the results. Within seconds, the dog that had been taught to control the shocks discovered that he could jump over the barrier and escape. The dog that earlier received no shocks discovered the same thing, also in a matter of seconds. But the dog that had found that nothing it did mattered made no effort to escape, even though it could see over the low barrier to the shockless zone of the shuttle box. Pathetically, it stood up. It soon gave up and lay down, though it was regularly shocked by the box. It never found that the shock could be escaped by merely jumping to the other side. They repeated the experiment on 8 triads of them. Only 2 of the dogs in the helpless group jumped over the barrier, whereas all the dogs in both other groups jumped over the barrier. And then, admittedly, this is a small sample size, but it's hard to fault Seligman over wanting to hurt fewer dogs, and the study might be considered too unethical to conduct now. It's almost certainly too unethical to conduct now. Shocking those dogs, poor dogs. Doges. This brings us back to the 3 P's of helplessness: permanent, pervasive, and personal, which will help us to better understand the nature of helplessness. To be hopeless is to perceive that one's own problems are personal, pervasive, and permanent. Did we already discuss this at some other chapter? I can't remember. Like the framing chapter. According to Seligman, it is dependent on the explanatory style that one uses to explain events. The style of internal explanations, much like metaphors, colors and textures an internal experience. Much like typography, we look through our explanatory style at our perception of the world. And the use of perception is important here because that's not, our perception of the world is not the world itself. For dogs, the feeling that they did nothing they did mattered, colored their experience, instilling in them in the belief that their behavior was irrelevant, disconnecting them from their agency. Explanatory style is like looking through tinted glasses. For the optimists, it's rose-colored glasses. Hey, Janala, how's it going? Welcome back. Seligman's work uses pessimism, depression, and helplessness in a way that's fairly interchangeable, so it may be helpful to clarify his model of them a little bit here. Depression is the clinical diagnosis that was reliant on multiple factors, but is especially problematic when it's chronic. When an event we perceive it to be bad happens, it brings us down and we usually bounce back. If we bounce back, then there really isn't a problem, and that's not depression. I'm not going to put that in there. But if we explain it to ourselves in a pessimistic manner, our explanatory style keeps us there, down, making us chronically depressed. When we become chronically depressed, we learn that we learn that our actions do not matter, and thereby become helpless. I'm about to stir the pot again. All right. So let's say we try and chat up the barista at our local coffee shop and our advances are rejected. Bummer. Perhaps the feeling is appropriate, but if we explain that rejection as a consequence of us being inherently unlovable, as opposed to perhaps the barista just being busy or working, or any other the limitless possibilities that have nothing to do with us, and internalize that we are unlovable, then we have a problem. Our explanatory style has brought us from being an individual situation to being unlovable. Unlovable is a strong word. It describes the impossibility of being an object of love, and if that's the case, why bother? Why bother? Let's take a step back for a moment and examine the problem from the larger project of agency. If we reach the point where we're asking ourselves why bother, then it's clear that somewhere along the lines of our thinking, we've cut ourselves off from any action. This is the perniciousness of helplessness. Resignation to our fate cuts us off from action. Now, this isn't an injunction to bombard the poor barista with unrequited advances, a change in our approach, the person we approach, and or ourselves being appropriate. This is an injunction to view the statement of why bother and other statements like it as a red flag, and others like it as a red flag that helplessness might be afoot. To understand helplessness better, let's go back to Seligman's model of the 3 Ps. I never understood chronic depression. Like, are they depressed over something specific? It probably depends on the person. I know I have, over long stretches of my life, struggled with depression, and it's never been over anything specific. It's just this, like, feeling. For example, if they got a hot goth girlfriend and Millie, they'd stop being depressed, right? No. So if you, like, that would not fix it. That would indicate that they just are in a bad situation. Although there's like multiple ways of interpreting depression. Right. Like some people will want to talk about a chemical imbalance. Some people will want to talk about environmental factors. Some people think that sort of thing would fix depression. My experience with depression, and I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, is that it generally doesn't have to do with anything specific, and often the times where I've been the very most depressed in my life, nothing specific has gone wrong. Like, the feeling of, like, helplessness or, like, what's the point of anything, are extremely strong despite nothing bad happening. And usually when an acute negative event happens, usually I'm actually fairly inspired to take action, and I'm almost never depressed when something really bad happens to me. It's usually just in a period where, like, it feels like nothing is going right, and that feeling that nothing is going right, notice that I said it feels that nothing is going right, not nothing is going right, because I think it's the case that what depression does is it warps your perception and makes you interpret stuff like nothing's going right, when that might not even necessarily be the case. And the fact that it is coloring your perspective, and it's like your perception of reality is distorted in such a way that you are interpreting reality negatively, that's what I would say is like the crux of depression, more so than like a specific event being wrong or bad. People who have a pessimistic explanatory style tend to have a tendency to explain bad events as being permanent. They tend to think that bad events or situations will persist, and will tend to use words like always and never to describe things. I'll never be good enough. Bad things always happen to me. As Seligman writes, failure makes everyone at least momentarily helpless. It's like a punch to the stomach. It hurts, but the hurt goes away. For some people, almost instantly. For others, the hurt lasts. It seethes, it roils, it congeals into a grudge. Optimists, on the other hand, tend to explain negative things in a more temporal way, i.e., sometimes, lately, and explain positive things using more permanent language that the pessimists use for negative events. Like, I'm always handsome. You can't relate? You've only been depressed over something specific, mainly girls, but that shit goes away after a week or so? Yeah. The girls don't help. In my experience. Or, like, only when you're in, like, the dopamine, like, rush phase of things, like, is it a thing. But, like, the being in a relationship long term isn't, like, more helpful than, like, not being in a relationship or something like this. Seligman wraps the idea of pervasiveness in a rather nice metaphor when he captured it thus. Permanence is about time, pervasiveness is about space. Individuals have a pessimistic explanatory style, tend to be worse at compartmentalizing the negative aspects of their life to their respective areas. Issues that pertain to their jobs or relationships, for example, will bleed into other areas of life in their explanations, and by extension, their emotions. Instead of, I'm terrible at this, the pessimist says, I'm terrible at everything, or the ubiquitous, I'm a terrible person. These sorts of internal explanations color one's environment with a large brush and dark-colored paint. It burns the bridge we are trying to agency. Just like permanence, the optimistic version of the explanatory style is reversed. Positive things are explained in terms... Is that terms? Terms. Of universal generalizations, and negative things in the specific particulars. I'm good at everything I put my attention to. I'm just not very good at that. For Seligman, the first two P's of the three P's are of the most primary importance for informing helplessness, both in theory and practice. Individuals who interpret their misfortunes as being both temporary and compartmentalized tend to be better at bouncing back from such misfortune. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. After all, why would anyone put their effort into understanding After all, why would anyone put their effort into something if their understanding was that their effort was irrelevant? Their efforts were irrelevant. I think this should be singular. Is the book going over procrastination? That's the bane of your existence. Procrastination was more in last chapter, or 2 chapters ago. Last block. It does go over procrastination, but I don't think we'll be seeing too much more of it. You can find the VODs on the YouTube, though. On the Ideas YouTube. Oh, darn. Yeah, we're not gonna go through an entire rehashing of the stuff on procrastination, but almost a big part of it is that almost any time you need to exhibit any real agency, it requires being proactive, and proactivity is the opposite of proactivity is procrastination, and so this becomes like a really fundamental impediment to agency. But one of the most useful things for procrastination, or one of the most useful exercises, I think we can just briefly describe, even though we're not going to talk too much about procrastination, is that you can set a timer for 5 minutes and commit to doing whatever it is you've been putting off for 5 minutes. And usually 5 minutes doesn't sound that bad. And it is a lot less cognitively painful than saying I'm going to sit down and do this thing. And so the point is just to get started. And then usually, and by the way, when the 5-minute timer dings, if you don't want to be doing the thing anymore, you're fully and 100% free to stop. But the thing is usually when we are procrastinating, we are actually thinking that something is going to be way more painful and uncomfortable and unfun than it actually is. And if we just get started doing it, usually it's not as bad as we thought it was going to be, and we can go and complete it even though we had only committed to 5 minutes. And so, like, even going to the gym is like this. So, like, for the 5 minutes, you just set a timer on your phone for 5 minutes, and then you get dressed to go to the gym. You know, you go to your car, you get the car started, you back out of the driveway or whatever, and then the 5-minute timer dings, and then if you don't want to go to the gym no more, you just roll back up your driveway. But you'll probably feel like, once you're already getting started to going to the gym, that it's just like, well, okay. And every step of the way, it's really not as bad as you think it was going to be, or as you thought it was going to be. This is the key for agency. We must feel that what we do matters, because if we don't, we will open ourselves to helplessness. Failure, as it is commonly understood, is a failure that takes place in commission. We make an attempt, and we don't get the outcome we want. The failures of helplessness, in some sense, are far more sinister because they are concealed from us and don't provide us with useful feedback. They are failures of omission. Failures not only of that's impossible and why bother trying, but also ones of the potential realities that don't even enter our awareness. It's interesting to wonder whether the helpless dogs even considered escape as a potential action. The distinction between commission and omission is reminiscent of the distinction between modern and ancient Greek ethics in that one might problematize these two failures differently. Specifically, the modern ethics would be more apt to problematize the failure of commission as the failure of being the wrong act, while overlooking failures of omission. The ancient Greek ethos, on the other hand, might be more concerned with the stylization than the success, and thus the problematization, and thus problematizes failures of omission and lack of proper stylization more. The style in which we explain events to ourselves is internal, but it involves a practice in the sense that we are free to explain things to ourselves in a variety of ways, and we can refine our practice, in this case, the internal explanatory style. That we are capable of interpreting reality in a variety of ways makes us responsible for doing so, if it is a worthwhile practice. Personalization is regarding whether one views events as being internally or externally caused. It addresses two concepts we are deeply concerned with: responsibility and perception of agency. To explain ourselves as the cause of an event, we have to both assume our ability to cause it or agency, and we have to also place the responsibility for that outcome on ourselves. For example, we could give our friend a new pair of shoes. We have that ability, but we would likely consider it inappropriate to consider ourselves the cause of their not having a new pair of shoes, as it is not our responsibility. It is similarly inappropriate to regard ourselves as the cause of something we are powerless to affect. So what does personalization have to do with helplessness? When bad things happen, we blame ourselves, internalize, or we can blame others, people's circumstances, externalize, Seligman writes. People who blame themselves when they fail have a low self-esteem as a consequence. They think that they are worthless, talentless, and unlovable. People who blame external events do not lose self-esteem when bad events strike. We should pause for a moment and critically examine one of the implications here. That we ought to, if our aim is to avoid helplessness, interpret negative events in one way as temporary/particular, and positive events in another as permanent/general. A common defense of what Seligman is characterizing as pessimism is that it is simply realism. This should be it is. Seligman advocates this unequal explanatory style, that one should interpret positive events differently than negative events, for the first two P's but not the third, personal. With the exception of people who are depressed, Seligman is right to point out that externalizing every explanation is tantamount to never taking responsibility for one's actions, and even advises against it, except in the cases of depressed people. For especially depressed people, he argues that their explanatory style likely takes more personal blame than would be appropriate and advocates an adjustment, though to be fair, he's fairly fast and loose with the distinctions between pessimism and depression. Back to the realism point. That stylizing our explanatory style in an optimistic way might not be realistic. We should take a look at this objection with some fair degree of weight. It isn't frivolous. We want our maps of reality to be useful, and that usually means accurate. This is out of order. On the other hand, listening to Frankel's account of the concentration camps makes such realism in extreme situations seem anything but useful. To be realistic in a concentration camp was to accept helplessness and death. Where are we? How far are we? We're halfway through, okay. Perhaps it is the case that we should look more carefully at evidence that supports an explanatory style. Oftentimes, there are unclear situations where one's interpretation warrants one behavior and another view warrants another course of action. When this happens, it's useful to ask ourselves, which error am I more okay with committing? These type of questions can offer a different perspective than the more traditional, which action is better. Do I have an example? No? Okay. Okay. I think that's true, but I wish I had an example. Rumination, or dwelling on events in this style, is a secondary component. It is a sort of way of qualifying the explanatory style explanation. If we have a pessimistic explanatory style but never explain things to ourselves, we could hardly be seen as reinforcing our helplessness. When we have to actually engage in the explanations, pessimistic or optimistic, for the style to have an effect. In some sense, it's like a product of a multiplication problem. Explanatory style is multiplied by the rumination time equals helplessness. Being a ruminator alone isn't enough to become helpless if we ruminate positively. Similarly, having a pessimistic explanatory style isn't enough to become helpless if we never do any explaining. This brings us back to our mental exercise analogy. A great workout done infrequently will produce lackluster results, as will bad workouts done frequently. Random question: do Americans consider Italians and Greeks to be white? I can't speak for all Americans. I would consider Italians and Greeks to be white, but also would note that, there are a variety of ethnicities which can pass for white sometimes and not pass other times. And so race in that sense is distinct from ethnicity, because there are probably some really dark Greeks, and there might be really dark Italians, although I don't know as much about the thing. I can tell you that there are a lot of Armenians that are really white and Armenians that are really dark, and the dark Armenians would not pass for white, in my opinion, and the light ones would. And so asking the ethnicity for Armenians, for example, might not be useful. Egyptians is probably another one. There are some pretty light-skinned Egyptians, and then there are also a lot of dark-skinned Egyptians. So I also don't care too much who gets categorized as white or not. So it's not important for me to find out what exactly I think about that. What's Seligman's prescription for changing explanatory style? He advocates for CBT, albeit a version that's structured a little bit differently than the 4 steps we examined earlier. The principle is still the same. Interrupt unwanted thoughts, challenge them, and reinterpret. He calls his 5-step method ABCDE, with each letter corresponding to a step. The aim is to dispute pessimistic explanation. Let's take a look. So this is the next mental exercise. A complete list of cognitive distortions, which are often the target of disruptions, can be found on the appendix on page blank. We obviously don't have page numbers out that deep and this type of thing, and it's not formatted, so we don't have that. Also haven't done the list of all the cognitive distortions we wanted to do. Adversity. The difficulty or challenging situation. A particularly good heuristic is looking at the situations we find ourselves ruminating over. So if you're ruminating over, girlfriend problems, or if you're spending a lot of time thinking about something, this is a sign that maybe we need to examine the way that we are examining it. Belief. This is our initial explanation of the event. Of particular importance, we want to examine the ways in which our belief is labeled the underlying cause of the event as being permanent, pervasive, or and as a consequence of our behavior or who we are. Consequences. In order to see why we ought to fight our explanation, we have to first examine our consequences of it. Once we see negative effects that our pessimistic explanation will have, we become better motivated to dispute that explanation. D. Disputation. Challenge the belief that we reactively make. Looking at an appendix of cognitive distortions listed above can provide a good resource of inspiration of the distortions we are prone to make. Seligman gives 4 methods of disputation. Evidence. The most convincing way of disputing a negative belief is to show that it's factually incorrect, Seligman writes. Alternatives. Another way of explaining a way of explaining this adversity than our initial belief? Is there another way? There are often multiple causes for a single event. For example, we talked about the barista rejecting us. The barista might have a boyfriend she really likes, bro. She's not going to give you her number. And this is different than you being unlovable. There are often multiple causes for a single event. Seligman advises us to focus on the causes that are specific, changeable, and non-personal. Implications. Our initial belief may be correct, but in our judgment of the implications of that initial belief may be prone to catastrophizing. We should be measured in our intentional. We should be measured and intentional, in our evaluation of the implications. And this is like such an interesting one to me that like you can get it right when describing it negative, but what that means in a larger sense can just be completely off. Usefulness. Sometimes the belief may be true, but it isn't useful to attend to. In such cases, we want to redirect our attention to something more resourceful. And then we have E, energization. Record how this process has left you more energized and with better resources to deal with adversity. This has the dual purpose of patting ourselves on the back and reinforcing this process and drawing our attention back to the process of attending. We can proactively set aside time to engage in ABCDE process, but it's important that we have adversities to run through it. For this reason, it might be useful to keep an adversity log or journal, record such adversities in it for the purpose of making disputations later, if making them in the moment might not seem appropriate. Let's take an example from Seligman's book. I'm not sure if I can lift this entire quote, but we'll see. Adversity. I threw a dinner party for a group of friends, and the person I was trying to impress barely touched our food. Belief. The food tastes putrid. I'm such a lousy cook. I may as well forget getting to know her any better. I'm lucky she didn't get up and leave in the middle of dinner. Consequences. I felt really disappointed and angry at myself. I was so embarrassed by my cooking that I wanted to avoid her for the rest of the night. Obviously, things weren't going as I hoped. Disputation. This is ridiculous. I know the food doesn't taste putrid. Evidence, because you tried it. She may not have eaten very much, but everyone else did. Evidence. There could be 100 reasons why she didn't eat very much. Alternatives. She could be on a diet. She might not have been feeling great. She might have just had a small appetite. Alternatives. Even though she didn't eat much, she did seem to enjoy the dinner. Evidence. She told some funny stories and she seemed to be relaxed. Evidence. She offered to help me with the dishes. Evidence. She wouldn't have done that if she was repulsed by me. Alternative. Energization. I didn't feel nearly as embarrassed or angry, and I realized that if I had avoided her, I would really hurt my chances of getting to know her better. Basically, I was able to relax and not let my imagination ruin the evening for me. Okay, so responsibility, optimism, and placebo. Back to Auschwitz. Many of the prisoners at Auschwitz gave into hopelessness and resigned themselves to death. As far as environments go, it was as bad as helpless an environment as possible. But Frankl touched on something that is quite similar to Seligman's explanatory style analysis. I'll be brief, as we'll be covering it more in depth in the next chapter, but Frankl advocates for a type of mental activity that combats the pessimistic aspect of the explanatory style that is both permanent and pervasive. The two that Seligman marched as being especially important. Frankl advocates for looking forward to the future as a means of escaping the permanence of the present, and knows that no matter what one takes from you, they cannot take everything. No imposition can pervade your capacity for you to determine what things will have meaning to you. This is a single inalienable quality. To decide what things mean to us is what's important to emphasize. It is our ability to determine what things mean to us that we can always seize control of, and that this feeling of control that what we do really matters, that this is centrally important to no. Uh-oh. I clicked the wrong button. No! Can't be fixed. I'm helpless. Okay, I think this is where we were. I do that evidence gathering I do that evidence gathering too, but I see it as a lack of internal self-esteem. The which one do you mean on evidence? Here, let's highlight where we were and scroll back up. On evidence, the negative evidence gathering, you mean? Giving you negative feedback and you see it as a lack of self-esteem? The one quote from Chronicles of Thomas Covenant has always haunted me. There's only one way to hurt a man who has lost everything. Give him back something broken. Basically. That's a pretty banger quote. I like that. No imposition can pervade your capacity to determine for yourself what things will have meaning to you. This is a singular, inalienable quality to decide what things mean to us. What's always important to emphasize. It is our ability to determine what things mean to us that we can always seize control of, and it is this feeling of control that what we do matters that is centrally important to staving off helplessness. It's also interesting to note, here we have a footnote, the similarity between this and part of our discussion on free will, that being able to continue to attend to something is the singular site at which we exercise free will. So the Frankel stuff is very consistent with that. You mean evidence that people like me and I do good work? Oh, so you do it to combat a negative thing? That's good. That's what you should do. Like if you think your perception's warped in a particular way, you should try and unwarp it. Recall Covey's circle of influence. One of his central arguments is that by being proactive about the things we control, we can expand our circle of influence. We expand our agency. If we are instead reactive, our circle of influence shrinks. Part of this argument hinges on the feelings of control, realizing that control in actuality. In order to be proactive, we must attend to the things we can control. But as we learned with our discussion of learned helplessness, if we feel that we have no control, we learn that nothing we do matters. The feeling that we can have control becomes central. This is the process of expecting to have control over our actions and lives. Creating actual control can be explained by one of the many cognitive biases we'll cover, the placebo effect. The placebo, after which the placebo effect is named, is a type of prescription that's given that has no active ingredient that will work other than our expectation that it will. There's a famous Henry Ford quote which captures the spirit of placebo effect as it relates to Covey's argument. Whether you think you can or you can't, you're right. It's standard practice for any pharmaceutical company creating a new drug to test it against a placebo. This is because almost every drug works. They just don't all work better than a placebo. A sugar pill with no active ingredients will often address symptoms, especially pain, in a significant way. For that reason, in order to get drug approval, it needs to do more than just work. It has to work better than a placebo. But the placebo effect, that our expectations affect outcomes, isn't just present in pharmaceutical setting. Whoa, patient-controlled analgesia. This is not fleshed out yet. We have to write this still. But there's this study where they let the patients control their own pain drip, and they actually prescribe themselves less morphine than if they don't have control over their pain drip, and it's the feeling of control, of agency, that is perhaps driving the sense that they are feeling better. Their control over medication, they administered their own morphine. One of the concerns with this approach was that patients might abuse the painkiller and become addicted, but what they found is they actually used less painkiller and had better pain reduction when they controlled their own stuff. But we have to find this, I have to track down this study so that I could cite it and write about it properly. The Pygmalion Effect first person study. Oh, I don't even know what that refers to, so I can't talk about it now. When we discussed neuroplasticity, we noted that our active attending was an important component for achieving neuroplasticity. One of the aspects was feeling as though we had control, is that we attend more closely, and we had a feeling of agency. Obviously, this isn't all the way written out. For those of you who don't know, my parenthetical asides means I need to come back to this and deal with it. But then we have the cat neuroplasticity study, which this study is gnarly. Or most people hate hearing about this study. I think this study is super interesting, but there's also a study of people who have been tortured where some developed PTSD and some didn't. Those who exercised control over something, even just when to scream, more often didn't. That's an interesting one. Speaking of heavy stuff that might not necessarily be important to include, although the cat study is really heavy too. So the cats were yoked together. What they did is they sewed a bunch of cats' eyes shut, and then to impede their neuroplasticity, the development of their brain in the visual areas, because if you don't get any stimulus, that area of the brain will atrophy. That's how neuroplasticity works. And then they opened the eyes of them and saw if they could readjust after several weeks, and see if they could see. What they did is they actually yoked cats in a harness together. So one cat would be able to... Both cats now had their eyes open after having their eyes sewn shut for several weeks. And one cat would be able to walk around and see the world and interact with the other world. And the other cat would be experiencing the exact same visual stimulus because they were connected with a harness, but they would not be able to walk around. They would just be transported along with the cat that was walking around and see all the same things. And what they discovered was that the agency exhibited by the first cat, who could walk around, even though they were getting all the same visual stimulus, led to much more development in the areas of the brain associated with vision, and that cat had much better vision as a result. And so the indication here is that agency is like a necessary component for the neuroplasticity. Both cats were exposed to the same visual stimulus, but only one would have been able to control where the pair went. So it was very similar to the yoked study with the dogs. The difference was their ability to interact with their environment. And then, of course, we have stuff, which is the conclusion. I forget the exact conclusions. We got to re-look at the study. It's been a hot minute, but I don't even know what this refers to, so let's highlight it. But it seems to be the case that you need to have the combination of actually feeling like you have control in order to develop your brain. And so this feeling of control is very, very important. And so it's not only just like feeling you have control over certain events, but also focusing on the events that you actually have control over, so that you are having a feeling of control more often. Maybe we put that in kind of down here, because I think that's an important point. I remember you telling about that cat study in a previous chapter. Is it duplicated in the book? I think that we just talked about this cat study and we didn't read about it. But if we duplicated it, then that's not ideal. I don't think we want to talk about it twice. if I did, it was in the neuroplasticity chapter, but I don't think we actually talked about the cat study. I think that the cat study is like it's relevant to the neuroplasticity chapter because this is important, but I think it fits better here. But I probably talked about it. Okay, so now we'll have another model of depression because that's what we're doing here. We're giving multiple models. I wonder if gaming is a process of attending to events you have control over. I definitely think that that's like well, so I think that people often play video games because it gives them a feeling of agency. And it's kind of a form of escapism because they don't feel like they have control in like the real world. And it is attending to things you have control over, but it's very often video games are on like closed loops. Or a lot of games are. In the sense that, or I guess to some extent all games, but to some extent life, but the feeling of agency is not always like one that it actually has to do with mastery and skill. Sometimes it's just a simulation of agency where the player doesn't actually really have control, they just feel like it. But this feeling of agency is really important for games to like be entertaining as well, which I think is one of the things about Victoria 3 that's a little bit rough. Is a lot of times you are doing something in Victoria 3, it's affecting an equilibrium, it's affecting something down the road, and so it's not giving you that immediate sense that you're controlling something, which is like often I think what people want in a video game, right? Like you can click a button and then your character runs, and so it gives you this low effort amplified feeling of being an agent. Seligman makes an argument that pessimism and helplessness are depression, and while this raises issues regarding causation and versus correlation, he makes a fairly strong argument. It's a coherent model of depression, but just like any other model, it brings in certain types of information to the foreground, namely explanatory style and the solution of cognitive therapy. Socrates taught us that that we ought to be generous to the opposite direction, and Da Vinci taught us we also ought to synthesize multiple perspectives. So what of an account of depression that brings the environment into the foreground? In his book Lost Connections, Johann Hari makes the argument that situates the environment rather than situates. That's really bad spelling of situates. The environment rather than an internal stylization as being of central importance in explaining that the primary cause of all this rising depression and anxiety is not in our heads. It is, as I've discovered, largely in the world and the way we are living in it. So now we're going to turn back and look at the environment much in the way we kind of like looked at like the influence and this type of thing. Hari's position of external emphasis is not placed in direct opposition to Seligman's explanatory style, but rather against the biological explanation of depression, that it is reducible to mere chemical imbalance. Both he and Seligman recognize that there is a biological component to depression, but Hari argues that a chemical imbalance is given disproportionately often, much to the benefit of the pharmaceutical companies, and that if we really want to understand depression, we have to look at the environment. Hari notes that 2/3 of, so here we have me not fully written out. We have more sections that I've not fully written out. These will become more common as we get deeper and deeper into the chapters. Hari notes that 2/3 of the efficacy of antidepressants, whose aim is to fix the chemical imbalance, comes from the placebo effect. Was it 2/3 comes from the placebo? Or was it an enormous portion, only like 1/3 comes from the efficacy of the drug? I know there's three things, which is that placebo's the biggest one. I don't know if this 2/3 is correct, so we're going to highlight it. Placebo's the biggest one. Another really big one is people tend to get better on their own, and then another one is the actual efficacy of the drug. Most of the efficacy comes from the placebo effect, but the side effects are very real. He frames this thing in terms of lost connections, which is that we've lost, various connections to. Here. Maybe we'll take a quick look at his book. Lost connections. Is there a Wikipedia page for this? Well, there's one for Johann Hari. Let's see if there's Johann Hari. Let's see if there's a section. No, there's not a section on lost connections. Unfortunate. I'm trying to remember all 9. There's like 9, but like it's like disconnection with people, like disconnection from work, meaningful work, disconnection from nature is kind of like towards the end. Various things that like modern life just kind of alienates us from like what would be normal human relations, and this is the crux of his thing. There's a lot of overlap in Hari's interest in both addiction and depression. He wrote another book on addiction called Chasing the Stream, which is largely focused on the external environment. And so it's a common theme, which is that he talks about systemic problems and how things that are often attributed to individuals and individual agency are largely indicative of a larger societal problem. And so Chasing the Scream is about that. Hari claims that addictions are functional responses to experiences and a lack of healthy, supportive relationships rather than a simple biological need for a particular substance and lost connections. Let's see. Okay, yeah, it doesn't give a very long explanation of this. Stolen Focus is his latest book. Do like that one. Stowe. Ooh, claims of misrepresentation in books. Let's take a quick look at this. A little spicy, maybe. Due to previous scandals, Hari put audio in some interviews conducted in Chasing the Scream online. Writer Jeremy Duns criticized instances where quotes were inaccurately transcribed or misrepresented, stating that out of a sample of a dozen clips, in almost all cases, words and quotes had been changed or omitted without being noted, often for no apparent purpose, but in several cases subtly changing the narrative. In a review for New Matilda, Michael Bruhl expressed reservations about Hari's citational practices and highlighted contradictions between the narrative in Chasing the Scream and a 2009 article by Hari. Journalist Zoe Stavry criticized the work Lost Connections for its lack of citations for key claims, like between 65 and 80% of people on antidepressants are depressed again within a year. Reliance on the work of a single researcher, treating research on a single class of antidepressants as if it applies to all antidepressants, and conflating stress and depression. The psychologist and writer Richard Stewart Ritchie criticized Hari for repeatedly making the claim that between 65 and 80% of people on antidepressants will be depressed again within a year. Without a clear citation, he traced the source of the claim to a pop science rather than a review of scientific literature. Okay. We're still going to talk about Hari's model, but Stuart Richard and the neuroscientist Dean Burnett both criticized Stolen Focus for failing to cite strong evidence for the claim that shrinking attention spans, as well as presenting mainstream psychological concepts about niche ideas that Hari discovered. Interesting. Writer-broadcaster Matthew Sweet investigated some of the claims of the book and found that Hari had failed to cite the primary sources for some of the studies and misrepresented the results of studies that suggested that multitasking could have benefits in certain conditions. Okay, fair enough. Interesting, though. All right, back to the thing. So there's a study about rats who are addicted, that they get addicted to drugs, and they found that when present with like 2 bottles of water in a cage, and the rat can take the one that is just regular water and the one that's filled with drugs, the rat will just take the one that's filled with drugs, or will just give themselves drugs until they kill themselves. Something like this. But what if rats weren't abusing drugs simply because they were available? In the disputation portion of the ABCDE exercise, we're encouraged to look for alternatives. What if the rats abused drugs because they were available and their lives were devoid of meaning? Which brings in one of the most interesting studies, which is the rat park study, where they made drugs available to the rats, but they actually gave the rats like an enriched environment with a bunch of other rats to interact with, so social interaction. Rats are actually very social, so anytime you're doing a study on rat, when they're forced to be alone, is like stressful to the rat. But they also had a bunch of stuff to interact with and play on and this type of stuff, and what they found in that study was that the rats don't just drug themselves like into oblivion, and in fact they tend not to take the drugs. And so that is quite an interesting study. We can maybe take a look here, because we just had this like parenthetical aside, and maybe we can find the rat park study on Wikipedia, or a little explanation of it. Rat Park was a series of studies into drug addiction conducted in the 1970s, published between 78 and 81. Oh my god, my back itches and I can't reach it. The truth hurts. At the time of the studies, the research exploring the self-administration of morphine in animals was small and solitary mental cages. Alexander hypothesized that these conditions may be responsible for exacerbating self-administration. To test the hypothesis, Alexander and his colleagues built at Rat Park, a large housing colony 200 times the floor area of a standard laboratory cage. There were 16 to 20 rats of both sexes in residence, food, balls, and wheels for play, and enough space for mating. The results of the experiment appeared to support his hypothesis that improved housing conditions reduced the consumption of the morphine water. This research highlighted an important issue in the design of morphine self-administration studies of the time, namely the use of austere housing conditions, which confounded the results. Which is like the drug is not the driver of, you know, the destructive behavior, as much as like being in a terrible situation and having drugs is a driver of you know, taking way too much of them. Okay. And then he discussed concerns of veterans returning from Vietnam, where like a ton of veterans who were in Vietnam abused drugs, and then what ended up happening is that when they were put in a new environment where that was not Vietnam, and I'm talking about not Vietnam the place, but Vietnam like the conflict, like being a fighter in the Vietnam War, as a context, a lot of the people just stop using drugs. So what types of prescriptions might Hari advocate for? Give them a cow example. Oh, this is like intervention where like Hari had talked to like people from a village or something, and like if someone's depressed, they suggest just give them a cow. Something like this. But that's obviously an external thing, solution for depression, not a, or there was someone who, like, lost his leg, or something, I think, in Hari's book, and he was depressed, and, like, the Western, like, narrative was like, oh, you just give him antidepressants, and then the narrative of the people, like the people who lived there, like the tribe, semi-tribal or indigenous people, I can't remember at this point, but the idea was that he was comparing it to Western medicine, so he was comparing like this more holistic thing in a positive light. They're like, just give him a cow, because the problem was the guy became disconnected from meaningful work when he lost his leg because he couldn't work the farm, but raising a cow is somehow some type of work you could do without a leg, and the idea was if you give him a cow, he would be able to engage in meaningful work again, and I think they gave him a cow, and I think he was happier or something. I can't remember. But it's interesting to note that both Hari's externally focused and Seligman's internally focused models of depression both push the biological factors of depression into the background. Both admit that genetics is definitely a factor in depression, but neither emphasize it, and Hari actively seeks to undermine the chemical imbalance narrative. What happens if we are biologically predisposed to depression, and medication is effective but not particularly so, as Hari suggests? Do we resign ourselves to depression? No, not if we follow either Hari or Seligman's models. What's significant for both of these aforementioned models is they both provide a practice, an avenue towards agency. They tell us that our depression is not permanent, though they each offer very different ways out. A biologically focused model would also tell us, if we are depressed, that there is something wrong with us. It's a personal way that explanatory style and environment are not. A biologically focused model may very well be accurate, but it's not helpful. The problems. No, so we're kind of going to bring the entire chapter together here, if I recall correctly. The problems are somewhat complex here, but let's focus on the structure of two seemingly oppositional forces. On one hand, we have thinfluence and lost connection, models that highlight the profound impact that external environment has on us. On the other hand, we have Frankel's account of transcending tragic circumstances through directed attention and Seligman's advocacy of refining explanatory style as a means of inoculating oneself against helplessness and depression. To use a bit of Seligman's language, we have a pair of models that externalize responsibility and a pair of models that internalize responsibility. The problem here is that we want to use both to inform our practice. This theme of juxtaposing and navigating antagonizing forces should be becoming familiar. Problems that have simple solutions aren't very problematic at all. But we should keep in mind that, just like with the two models of attention, these models aren't really the opposites of each other. We should instead think of them as pulling different information into the foreground, much like our discussion of the metaphor where thinking of love in terms of a journey or madness would structure our understanding differently. The difficulty for us is that prescriptions for the externalized model are seemingly contradictory with the internalized models. And then I have this highlighted because I want to rewrite it, but let's take a look at it. First, as the weight loss, addiction, and depression illustrate, to a large degree we are subject to our environment. Simultaneously, the feelings that we have no control and are victims of our environment creates feelings of learned helplessness. If we accept the first problem and work on it by attending to how our environment holds sway over us, we risk exacerbating the second problem of learned helplessness if our efforts are all ineffective. At the same time, if we focus on how we have control over our outcomes, we seemingly submit to the very real effect that our environment has on us by not letting how we deliberately shape our environment enter our attention. This is the third problem, that the solutions to the first two problems are seemingly antagonistic to each other. How do we use our attention and mental models to combat these problems? How can we use external models to inform action and internal ones to inform thought? In essence, how do we stylize our worldview such that we can have our cake and eat it too? There's a second antagonistic relationship here as well that we touched on earlier, that of taking responsibility and both optimistic explanatory style as well as environmental concerns. If we want to expand our circle of influence, Covey argues that we should take responsibility for as much as possible. Simultaneously, the research seems to indicate that a massive amount of causal force is contained in the external environment. Furthermore, Seligman's research on helplessness, especially the personal P, seems to indicate that we ought to take credit for the things that we ought to take credit for the good things. Good. It rhymes. Good things, and shift responsibility for the negative things onto external forces. After all, taking everything personal can lead to depression. A payout matrix might help to illustrate this antagonism, though it is important to note that what reality actually is difficult to determine, and will be colored by the models we use to represent it. Let's take a look. Our explanatory style can either be, we can internalize, or say we're responsible, or externalize and say the environment's responsible. Reality can either be good or... If we internalize, okay, and then reality, this is a response to good events and bad events. Okay. So if we internalize good events, it yields more optimism. We take responsibility. It potentially ignores external factors in our modeling. Okay. If we internalize bad events, it causes helplessness. We take responsibility. We potentially ignore external factors in our modeling by taking responsibility for our thing. If we externalize the good events, causes helplessness, avoids responsibility, more likely to recognize external factors in modeling. And if we externalize negative events, yields more optimism, avoids responsibility, more likely to recognize external factors in modeling. Okay. It should be noted that internalizing and externalizing are consistent for being good for taking responsibility and recognizing external factors respectively, regardless of whether the events are good or bad. It is for concerns regarding helplessness that the prescription changes depending on whether the event is good or bad. Ideally, we would want some sort of model of the world that either strikes a balance between taking responsibility and correctly modeling the world, or somehow gives us control over everything, and allows us to make a slight adjustments to internalize the good things and externalize the bad things. Balance would be the conservative approach. More aggressive would be to ask, once again, how do we have our cake and eat it too? How do we reap the benefits of taking responsibility and having an optimistic explanatory style while simultaneously being realists? Is there a way for us to take both responsibility for things while simultaneously blaming them on the external environment so that we can make adjustments that are sensitive to the forces the environment exerts on us? Couple of quick distinctions, but I never make the distinctions. Oh, okay, that's just kind of like a paragraph. First, it is conceptually, obviously we're getting into kind of the little roughness here. First is conceptually separating blameworthiness and responsibility. We can take responsibility for events that are not our fault, and often should, without blaming ourselves for them. We need to find example. What's a good example here? Well, taking responsibility means I'm going to be the one to change it, right? So you might not necessarily be the cause of an event, but you might say, okay, but I can be the one to change it. That's not an example, but that's an explanation of the type of thing we're looking for. But here we have the concept of shrinking the circle of concern, which is to say that if you focus less on the things that are outside of your control, then a higher proportion of the things you focus on will be within your control. In doing this, we both acknowledge our capacity to change the environment while simultaneously explaining the cause of negative events as being external. Okay. Sorry guys, it's a little choppy through these waters, which is maybe an indication that this project... And this is an important distinction. I'm bummed that we don't have a paragraph for this. But I think that a lot of people think that they are their behavior, and what your behavior is always something that you can change, and you are not, like, reducible to your behavior, although that is often how other people interpret you entirely from. So other people might, like... because that is the information that they have available... to, like, make a judgment of you, but you are free to change your behavior in a really, really profound way. And so looking at all your past behavior and saying that's who I am is putting yourself into a box that you don't have to put yourself into. Okay. Oh, this study has got some problems. We didn't know about those problems when we wrote this, but we can talk about it. Let's hone in a little bit on the types of solutions we want. We want an explanatory style that sidesteps helplessness and leaves us better prepared to take action, and we want a model that properly respects the great impact that the external environment can have on us. And this is... I feel like this has been a little schizophrenic through, like, the last 10 minutes or so. Basically, the entire problems thing which is maybe a reason why we have to reword it or rewrite it. But I mean, to try and like summarize what the problems are is we want to view external events as being heavily influencing us because they do. Or our environment is heavily influencing us because it does. And if we just ignore that, then we are going to be kind of ill-informed, or our map of reality is going to point us towards actions that aren't necessarily good. Cue pulling yourself up from your bootstraps montage. At the same time, when we explain all of these things as being outside of our control, this actually also decreases our agency in a profound way. And so we are at this sort of like impasse where it feels like we cannot explain things properly without encountering a different sort of problem with each sort of way, which is that if we say everything's within our control, it's just a matter of bootstrapping or whatever like this, then we will be helped on this will actually help us to be more effective in action, but it also improperly describes reality. All right, let's talk about priming. And then there's the third problem, which is that, not only do we have each of these problems with like the way how we view reality is going to distort or inform our perspective in a way that has a problem in each of those models, even if the problem is the solutions that both those models present are seemingly inconsistent with each other. And so the way out is going to be, spoiler, it's going to be that we focus more on stuff within our control while still trying to acknowledge the stuff outside our control, especially during planning elements or when we are engaged in planning. Okay, we're going to talk about priming. First, we need to better understand the mechanism that's creating these problems. A big part of the psychological explanation as to why our environment is so important and why explanatory style is effective is the phenomena of priming. As we discussed with metaphor, our brains primarily operate through association. They make associations incredibly quickly, often even if that association is not entering our awareness. Recall the original experiment Seligman walked in on, that they were trying to use Pavlovian condition to get the dogs to associate pain with the tone, such that the dog would exhibit a fear response upon hearing the tone. The best study, or the study that always gets mentioned when talking about priming, is this elderly words study, where participants had to solve anagrams that scrambled word puzzles for words that are associated with being older. And what they found is that when they solved words that were being associated with being older, like cane, walker, or like these types of things, that in a hallway afterwards they walked slower than the control group that was solving words that didn't have any such association. That is to say, even though they weren't necessarily aware of the theme or that they were solving for these types of things, they were still made to walk in a more elderly manner. Now, this study has some problems that I've found about since I wrote this, but I still think it's kind of the hallmark or one of the best explanations of it, and so I would probably just include the fact that it has some problems. But the other study that is somewhat talked about is the immersion in the 50s, 60s. I'm not sure which decade it was, but they took people who were elderly and they immersed them in basically a time capsule. I forget if it was for the 50s, 60s, or 70s, or what decade it was from. And what they found is the full immersion in the environment that they were in when they were in their 20s and 30s or whatever, by including newspapers and magazines and all this type of stuff. What they found, I think they also eliminated mirrors. What they found is they acted younger and that they actually had improved metrics of health as a result of being immersed in these, which is a further indication that priming, which is that when your environment, things in your environment will prompt you to think of things that are associated with those things. So if you read a word that has to do with being elderly, you will act more elderly. If you are immersed in an environment that reminds you of how you were or reminds you of being in your 20s, you will act more in your 20s, and you will even have marked improvements on your health when you are constantly bombarded with this priming effect. And so this is what I need to kind of do, what writing I have to do in order to kind of illustrate the priming effect before we go on. The covert nature of this influence in particular... the immersion studies down here. Damn it. The covert nature of this influence is of particular concern and is important to emphasize. That is, they're solving anagrams of these words. Recall that our attention is a part of the commons. It's in the public to be acted upon, and silence is no longer the status quo. You have to see billboards of advertisement. There's advertisement at the bottom of like the little tray that you like put your keys in when you go through the like checkout thing at the airport or the security check. What's particularly problematic about advertisements isn't that they are a sort of mind control. It's that their effect is in a large part concealed, much like how the students didn't even realize how they were walking slower. Advertisements prime us to be more open to utilizing a product or bringing our own reasons for buying a product into the foreground of our attention. In a sense, they get us to argue with ourselves on their own behalf. One of the ways to think of the advertisements and priming as in general is speaks to the elephant rather than the rider. So I guess I should watch 80s comics and play retro games. That would actually probably work. And even if it didn't work, the placebo effect of thinking it would work. Yeah. If you want to feel like you did back in the day, you could do that. I'm fairly confident if you did that for a week, and also changed your room, and got rid of your phone, right? Like just full immersion on it, you would actually feel much more like you did back then. Yeah. I forget what the presupposition study is. So I can't detail it. It's a common sales tactic, whether or not the salesperson is conscious of it, to ask questions that contain presuppositions. That's because they work. Expand means providing an example. So an example is, so how long have you been looking for a car? This presupposes that you're looking for a car, right? And in asking this, you prime the person to think about how long they've been looking for a car, but in order to think about that, you have to operate from the assumption that you are actually looking for a car. And so this primes you to think more from the orientation that you're actually looking for a car, and that you're interested in a car, or how long have you been interested in buying a car, is like an example of the type of line that a salesperson might drop. Also important to note with advertising is that most ads carry the presupposition that we're lacking something, that there's not a reason to feel fulfilled, and by buying their product, we fulfill the scarcity. It's scarcity and insecurity by design. There's an advertisement that talks about skin tags, and it's like, it just opens out with, skin tags are ugly and unsightly. And it's like, this might not have been something that you had thought about entirely, but now the ad has brought it to the forefront of your attention to make you think about it, to make you insecure about it, because this is they need to make you feel that you don't have something in order they can sell you something. And then we have this immersion study, which we talked about briefly, which is what we talk about here. Our questions ought not to be the type of how do we turn priming off, or how can we lessen the effect of priming. That's because if we recall the OCD in chapter 2, we cannot not think of something, and that's what priming is. How we think by making associations. It's an unconscious process, and we can't turn it off, nor would we want to. It pulls information our unconscious deems relevant into the foreground. We have to instead have the same kind of approach we had with OCD. We have to redirect it. We need to ask questions that are creative rather than destructive. How can we use priming to our own benefit? Going back to the topic of helplessness, A pessimistic explanatory style primes us to look at the world as if we are helpless to change it, and in doing so, we find evidence to support that. An optimistic explanatory style does the opposite, priming us to look at evidence throughout the fact that we are not helplessness and do in fact have agency in the world. And then we want to have a bit of an aside about taking responsibility. I don't know exactly what we wanted to say here. I wrote this book 4 years ago, so it's like it was a little bit rough when it's like I definitely knew what I wanted to talk about when I put this in. At the same time, explanatory style is not the only thing priming us, nor is agency merely about avoiding the internal feeling of helplessness. Helplessness impedes action, but is just part of the larger picture. As we saw, elements of our... I think we still want the past tense. As we saw, elements of our external environment also prime us. And the bridge we've been... also prime us, and the bridge we've been building is one which we're addressing the external. What we want with agency includes effective action that is outside the realm of our own mind, out there in the external environment. We cannot allow an emphasis on internal responsibility to turn into a complete withdrawal from the external world, making the internal mental activity being the only thing within our circle of concern. Our goal at the end of this bridge is, man, I feel like I'm relying on the reader so much to be thinking of so many of the things we've talked about and being able to recall it without prompting or giving them something with which to like hold on to with a lot of this when like trying to like bring it all together. At the same time, explanatory style is not the only thing that prizes us, nor is agency merely about avoiding the internal helplessness. Alright. Our goal at the end of this bridge is action. Mental action is just the instrumental tool by which we achieve that, but is not necessarily the end in itself. We need to be nuanced in the way we model things such that we can do three things. Take responsibility, direct ourselves internally, and cultivate an ecosystem, external environment that is conducive to creating effective action in the direction of our values. And then solve the problems of learned helplessness. But we don't have this written out. Okay. Mental exercise, state rehearsal. This is just reading through the states, thinking about them in your mind for 30 seconds, and then moving on. This exercise is going to involve first asking yourself questions of yourself. Namely, what emotional or mental states would you like to be able to access? We've seen how being shown words that relate to being elderly can make one walk slower down a hallway. What if we use the same process to make ourselves behave more youthful instead? And so we have to do some coming up with words to prime us, states we want to experience, and some examples include confident, energized, and then I need to come up with more examples. And the entire thing is we just read this, we think about it for like 20 or 30 seconds, and then we move on to the next one. And so if you have 10, and you think about each for 30 seconds, and you just let associations flow, it'll take about 30 seconds. Now, this isn't meant to have an enormously profound effect, but is meant to do just what we've been talking about, priming. The expression priming the pump originally referred to how liquid would be poured into a pump for fluids in order to flush the air out so that the pump can now operate. The purpose of primer in guns is responsible for lighting the propellant that is whatever propellant is shooting the projectile. A written text that is called a primer is meant to give you enough information in an area to just get you started. A primer lays the foundations necessary for real work to take place. By priming ourselves alone, we do not create an immediate change. We create the potential for change. The real work of agency, through agency through attention is directing our attention once we become aware that we should do so. One of the fundamental problems with attention and its effect on agency is that we do not choose what enters our attention. Priming is a tool by which we can affect what enters our attention, albeit in a subtle way, as the process itself is concealed from our attention. But this is what we need, a catalyst for creating opportunities for agency through directed attention. If we imagine action as a theatrical play, metaphors and mental models are the setting, the stage, the props, and the backdrop. The actors are directed attention, the movers through which the surrounding objects are turned into the story. Priming raises the curtain. Before Frankel was able to insist that the show of life being meaningful go on in the most hopeless of situations, he needed the show at the very least to be started. It's shocking how anyone managed to survive, but of those who survived, it is less shocking that Frankel was among the survivors. Psychology and the search for meaning were already primed in his awareness. If anyone was fit for finding meaning in a hopeless place, it was Frankel. And we could talk about logotherapy, which was the kind of his psychological theories at the time. He was primed to see meaning as well as matters of a more psychological nature. Like the biologist and the botanist, which we have a metaphor for. So, now we have a chapter summary here. The environment has a tremendous influence on us. It influences the things that enter our attention, and consequently, the things that we can continue attending to and the actions we can take. The belief that nothing we do matters, helplessness, is the ultimate impediment to agency as it cuts us off from action. We become helpless when we explain the negative aspects of our lives as permanent, pervasive, and personal. Explanatory style is one model for thinking of how we represent events to ourselves. We can utilize CBT to cultivate an optimistic explanatory self and inoculate ourselves against helplessness. The belief that what we do matters, that we have control over our outcomes, is fundamentally important for agency. Implicit in taking responsibility for events is the belief that we can control them. By taking responsibility for outcomes, we gain more influence over them. The problem here is that we want to use models that are inconsistent with each other. We want to use internally centric models centered on taking responsibility, and at the same time, we want to be sensitive to externally centric models which reveal how much is outside of our control. One way to explain the underlying influence of both internal and external models is the psychological idea of priming. When we are exposed to an idea, even if it doesn't enter our conscious awareness, it influences us by causing associated ideas to enter our attention or manifest in our behavior. The question is, how do we prime ourselves with intentionality into taking into consideration both internal and external models? And this question will be answered next chapter. Maybe also the I feel like the last maybe quarter of this was a little bit rough, and to be fair, part of it's rough because we haven't written everything and we wanted to rewrite some of these things, but I think part of it is also we are trying not to reveal the game. This is supposed to set up a problem, and it's only in the next chapter are we supposed to solve the problem. How many words is this? 9,000 words. Bam. But there we have it, the problem of helplessness. We'll be back next week, I think, with continuation, talking about chapter 6. Thank you for everyone who came out. There's a few of you. But I think we're just going to conclude the stream because we only have a couple viewers without any raids. So if you enjoyed, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, do the YouTube algorithm stuff.